This is Chestacho.
Cognitive biases are deviations from rational judgment, extensively researched in psychology, sociology, and behavioral economics. The existence of these biases is widely supported by reproducible research, though classification and explanation remain contentious. Some biases are theorized to stem from common mechanisms like noisy information processing. Gerd Gigerenzer criticizes framing biases as judgment errors, suggesting they are rational deviations from logical thought. Biases arise from mental shortcuts known as heuristics, leading to decisions, judgments affected by mental noise, cold bias, or wishful thinking. Hot bias. There's debate over whether certain biases are irrational or if they result in beneficial attitudes or behaviors, such as confirmation bias potentially serving as a social skill. Research on cognitive biases includes studies on non-human animals, indicating similar phenomena like loss aversion and hyperbolic discounting in monkeys, rats, and pigeons. Anchoring bias refers to the tendency to overly depend on the first piece of information, the anchor, when making decisions. It includes common source bias, where there's a preference for combining or comparing studies from the same source or methodology. Conservatism bias is part of anchoring, indicating a reluctance to update beliefs sufficiently with new evidence. Functional fixedness represents a limited approach to using objects only in their traditional sense. The law of the instrument exemplifies anchoring by showing an over-reliance on familiar tools, summarized by the adage, "If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail." Apophenia is the inclination to find meaningful connections between unrelated things. Clustering illusion involves overvaluing small patterns or clusters in large sets of random data, seeing patterns where none exist. Illusory correlation is the misperception of a relationship between two unrelated events. Pareidolia describes the tendency to interpret vague stimuli as significant, such as seeing faces in clouds or hearing hidden messages in reversed music. Availability heuristic. Overestimation of event likelihood based on memory, availability, influenced by recency, uniqueness, or emotional intensity. Anthropocentric thinking, using human analogies to reason about unfamiliar biological phenomena. Anthropomorphism, attributing human characteristics to animals, objects, or abstract concepts, contrasted by dehumanization, where human traits are denied in others. Attentional bias, perception swayed by frequent thoughts. Frequency, illusion, Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, belief that a recently noticed item appears frequently thereafter. Implicit association, faster word pairing based on closer associations. Salience bias, focus on prominent or emotionally striking items over unremarkable ones, regardless of objective importance. Selection bias, non-random sample selection leading to unrepresentative samples. Survivorship bias, focusing on survivors of a process while overlooking non-survivors due to their invisibility. Well-traveled road effect, underestimating time for familiar routes and overestimating for unfamiliar ones. Cognitive dissonance involves the discomfort experienced when encountering contradictory information. Normalcy bias is a type of cognitive dissonance where individuals refuse to plan for or respond to unprecedented disasters. Effort justification leads to overvaluing outcomes based on the effort invested, exemplified by the IKEA effect, where self-assembled products are deemed more valuable regardless of quality. The Ben Franklin effect suggests that performing a favor increases the likelihood of doing another favor for the same person, more so than if one had received a favor. Confirmation bias, the inclination to seek, interpret, and remember information that aligns with one's existing beliefs. Backfire effect, strengthening of original beliefs when faced with contrary evidence. Congruence bias, testing hypotheses only through direct testing, neglecting alternative hypotheses. Experimenters or expectation bias. Experimenters favor data that align with their expectations. discounting data that contradicts them. Observer expectancy effect. Researchers unconsciously influence experiments to produce expected outcomes. Selective perception. Expectations influencing perception. Semmelweis reflex. Rejecting new evidence that challenges established paradigms. Egocentric bias involves heavily relying on one's own perspective and perceiving oneself differently compared to others. Bias blind spot, seeing oneself as less biased than others and identifying more biases in others than in oneself. False consensus effect, overestimating how much others agree with one's views or behaviors. False uniqueness bias, believing one's abilities or projects are more unique than they actually are. Forer-Barnum effect, assigning high accuracy to vague, general personality descriptions thought to be tailored specifically. Illusion of asymmetric insight, believing one knows others better than they know oneself. Illusion of control, overestimating one's influence over external events. Illusion of transparency, overvaluing how much one's mental state is known by others and understanding others' mental states. Illusion of validity, overestimating the accuracy of one's judgments, especially with consistent or interrelated information. Illusory superiority, Lake-Wobegon effect, better than average effect, superiority bias. Overvaluing one's positive qualities and undervaluing negative qualities compared to others. Naive cynicism, expecting others to exhibit more egocentric bias than oneself. Naive realism, believing one's perception of reality is objective and unbiased, assuming agreement from rational people. Overconfidence effect, excessive confidence in one's answers or judgments, often leading to inaccuracies. Planning fallacy, underestimating the time needed to complete tasks. Restraint bias, overestimating one's ability to resist temptation. Trait ascription bias, viewing oneself as more variable in personality, behavior, and mood than others. Third-person effect, believing mass media messages affect others more than oneself. Extension neglect, failing to adequately consider sample size when making judgments or assessments. Base rate fallacy or neglect, overlooking general information in favor of specifics, even when general data is more crucial. Compassion fade, showing more compassion for a few identifiable victims compared to many anonymous ones. Conjunction fallacy, believing specific conditions are more likely than a general version of those conditions. Duration neglect, ignoring the duration of an experience when evaluating its value. Hyperbolic discounting, preferring immediate rewards over future ones, leading to inconsistent choices over time. Insensitivity to sample size, underestimating variability in small samples. Less is better effect, preferring smaller sets over larger ones when assessed separately. Neglect of probability, ignoring probability when making decisions under uncertainty. Scope neglect, insensitivity, being unresponsive to the magnitude of a problem when evaluating it, such as valuing solutions to small and large problems similarly. Zero risk bias, preferring to eliminate a small risk entirely, rather than significantly reducing a larger risk. False priors, initial beliefs that hinder unbiased evidence evaluation, leading to incorrect conclusions. Agent detection bias, assuming intentional intervention by a sentient agent without sufficient evidence. Automation bias, over-reliance on automated systems, potentially leading to ignoring correct decisions. Gender bias, implicit biases that lead to discrimination based on gender, such as undervaluing women's intellectual abilities or presuming gender based on lack of indicators. Sexual overperception, underperception bias, misjudging someone's level of sexual interest in oneself, either by overestimating or underestimating it. Stereotyping, assigning generalized attributes to individuals based on group membership rather than personal knowledge. Framing effect, different conclusions drawn from the same information based on presentation. Contrast effect, perception change of a stimulus when contrasted with a recently seen, different object. Decoy effect, a shift in preference between two options when a third, inferior option is introduced. Default effect, preference for default options when presented with multiple choices. Denomination effect, increased likelihood of spending when money is in smaller denominations. Distinction bias, viewing options as more dissimilar when evaluated together than separately. Domain neglect bias, overlooking relevant knowledge in interdisciplinary problem solving. Context neglect bias, ignoring the human aspect of technological challenges. Logical fallacy, errors in reasoning that undermine the logic of an argument. Bergson's paradox, misinterpretation of statistical experiments involving conditional probabilities. Escalation of commitment, sunk cost fallacy, increasing investment in a decision based on previous investments, despite evidence showing it may be wrong. G.I. Joe fallacy, belief that awareness of cognitive bias alone can overcome it. Gambler's fallacy, erroneous belief that future probabilities are influenced by past events, contrary to the law of large numbers. Hot hand fallacy, belief in increased success probability following a series of successes in random events. Plan continuation bias, persisting with an original plan despite changing conditions indicating it's no longer appropriate. Subadditivity effect, underestimating the probability of the whole compared to the sum of its parts. Time-saving bias, misjudging the time saved or lost when changing speeds, especially from a low or high base speed. Zero-sum bias, incorrect perception of situations as zero-sum games, where one's gain is presumed to come at another's expense. Prospect theory involves how people make decisions in situations of risk and uncertainty, emphasizing behavioral economics insights. Ambiguity effect, avoidance of choices where the probability of a favorable outcome is unclear. Disposition effect, tendency to sell assets that have increased in value, but hold on to those that have decreased. Dread aversion, the emotional impact of potential loss is twice as strong as the pleasure from potential gains. Endowment effect, valuing owned objects higher than the equivalent objects not owned, demanding more to give them up than to acquire them. Loss aversion, the discomfort of losing an object is perceived as greater than the pleasure of acquiring it. Pseudo-certainty effect, preference for risk-averse choices when expecting a positive outcome, but risk-seeking behaviors to avoid losses. Status quo bias, preference for the current state of affairs, resisting changes. System justification, defense of the status quo, even when it may not serve individual or collective self-interest, reflecting a preference for existing arrangements. Dunning-Kruger effect, unskilled individuals tend to overestimate their abilities, whereas experts often underestimate theirs. Hot-cold empathy gap, underestimation of how much visceral states, like hunger or anger, affect one's decisions and behaviors. Hard-easy effect, overconfidence in tackling difficult tasks and underconfidence in completing easy ones. Illusion of explanatory depth, overestimating one's understanding of complex topics, more pronounced with explanatory knowledge than procedural or factual knowledge. Imposter syndrome, persistent doubt about one's achievements and fear of being exposed as unskilled despite evidence of competence. Objectivity illusion, belief in one's own objectivity and lack of bias, failing to recognize this bias in oneself while identifying it in others. Belief bias, judgment of an argument's logic influenced more by how believable the conclusion is rather than the argument's actual validity. Illusory truth effect, repeated exposure to a statement makes it seem more true regardless of its factual accuracy. Rhyme as reason effect, rhyming statements are often perceived as more truthful or accurate. Subjective validation, perceiving statements as true when they align with one's beliefs and seeing connections in coincidences, closely related to confirmation bias. Action bias, preferring action over inaction in problem solving, even when inaction is more effective. Additive bias, favoring addition over subtraction in problem solving, despite subtraction being the better approach. Attribute substitution, replacing a complex judgment with a simpler heuristic judgment. Curse of knowledge, difficulty for informed people to think from the perspective of less informed people. Declinism, viewing the past positively and the future negatively. End of history illusion, believing one will change less in the future than in the past. Exaggerated expectation, predicting more extreme outcomes than what actually occurs. Form-function attribution bias, errors in expectations and perceptions based on a robot's appearance versus its true functions. Fundamental pain bias, believing in the accuracy of one's pain reports while thinking others exaggerate theirs. Hedonic recall bias, wage satisfaction affecting perceived earnings accuracy. Hindsight bias, viewing past events as having been predictable. Impact bias, overestimating the duration, shock, intensity of future emotional states. Information bias, seeking information that cannot affect actions. Interoceptive bias, hungry judge effect, bodily sensations influencing unrelated judgments. Money illusion, focusing on nominal value of money over purchasing power. Moral credential effect, permitting oneself to act less good after doing something good. Non-adaptive choice switching, avoiding a past decision after a bad outcome, even if it was optimal. Mere exposure effect, preferring things simply because they are familiar. Omission bias, viewing harmful actions as worse than harmful inactions. Optimism bias, overestimating the likelihood of positive outcomes. Ostrich effect, ignoring obvious negatives. Outcome bias, judging decisions by their outcomes, not by the decision quality at the time. Pessimism bias, overestimating the likelihood of negative outcomes, especially in depression. Present bias, valuing immediate payoffs more than future ones. Plant blindness, overlooking plants in one's environment. Prevention bias, preferring prevention over detection and response in risk management. Probability matching, matching choice probability with reward probability suboptimally. Pro-innovation bias, excessive optimism about an innovation's societal benefits, overlooking limitations. Projection bias, overestimating future alignment with current preferences, thoughts, and values. Proportionality bias, assuming big events have big causes, contributing to conspiracy theory acceptance. Recency illusion or bias, giving undue importance to recent events or believing recently noticed phenomena are new. Systematic bias, bias arising from non-equivalent regression effects in different judgment targets. Risk compensation, increasing risk-taking when feeling safer. Surrogation, confusing a measure for the construct it represents. Teleological bias, over-attributing purpose to non-goal-directed entities and events. Turkey illusion, not expecting sudden trend breaks. Unconscious, implicit bias, automatic judgments based on past experiences and background. Unit bias, consuming the suggested amount, even if it's inappropriate for the individual. Value selection bias, relying on existing numerical data in unfamiliar contexts, even when inappropriate. Weber-Fechner law, difficulty in perceiving small differences in large quantities. Women are wonderful effect, attributing more positive qualities to women than men. Association fallacy, errors in reasoning where conclusions are drawn based on associations rather than logical premises. Authority bias, overvaluing the opinions of authority figures regardless of the content's accuracy. Cheerleader effect, individuals appearing more attractive when viewed within a group than alone. Halo effect, one's overall impression of a person influencing perceptions of their specific traits. Actor-observer bias, over-attributing others' actions to personality and one's own actions to situational factors. Defensive attribution hypothesis, assigning more blame as harm severity or similarity to the victim increases. Extrinsic incentives bias, viewing others as motivated by external rewards and oneself by intrinsic motivations. Fundamental attribution error, overemphasizing dispositional factors for others' behavior while minimizing situational influences. Group attribution error, believing individual group members' traits represent the whole group or that group decisions reflect individual preferences against evidence. Hostile attribution bias, interpreting ambiguous or benign actions of others as hostile. Intentionality bias, assuming human actions are intentional rather than accidental. Just world hypothesis, believing the world is just and rationalizing injustices as deserved by victims. Moral luck, ascribing moral standings based on outcomes rather than intentions or actions. Puritanical bias, attributing undesirable outcomes to moral failings rather than societal influences. Self-serving bias, taking more credit for successes than failures and interpreting ambiguous information favorably. Ultimate attribution error, attributing the behavior of an entire group to innate characteristics rather than individual actions. Availability cascade, a belief becomes more plausible the more it's repeated in public discourse, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Bandwagon effect, following what others do or believe in, driven by the perception of majority consensus. Courtesy bias, modifying opinions to be socially acceptable, avoiding offense. Groupthink, decision-making within a group that prioritizes harmony and conformity over critical evaluation, suppressing dissenting views. Group shift, group decisions becoming more extreme, risk-seeking or risk-averse than individual inclinations. Social desirability bias, overstating socially desirable traits and understating undesirable ones in self-reporting. Truth bias, the tendency to believe others' statements regardless of their factual accuracy. In-group bias, favoring individuals who are perceived as part of one's own group. Not invented here. Resistance towards external ideas, products, or knowledge not originated within the group. Outgroup homogeneity bias, viewing members of outside groups as more similar to each other than those within one's own group. Assumed similarity bias, believing others share more similarities with oneself than they actually do. Outgroup favoritism. Some disadvantaged groups show preference for groups other than their own. Pygmalion effect. Higher expectations from others can improve an individual's performance. Reactance. The drive to do the opposite of what is asked to maintain a sense of freedom. Reactive devaluation. Discounting proposals simply because they come from an opponent. Social comparison bias. Preferring job candidates who don't compete with one's own strengths. Shared information bias. Groups focus more on information everyone knows rather than on new, unique information. Worse than average effect. Feeling inferior at tasks that are generally difficult for everyone. Misattribution of memory. Misidentifying the origin of a memory during recall, influenced by inability to control the influence of attitudes at retrieval. Cryptomnesia. Mistaking a memory for a new idea or imagination due to lack of subjective memory experience. False memory. Confusing imagination with actual memory. Social cryptomnesia. Society's failure to remember the origin of significant changes, overlooking the contributions and sacrifices of minorities. Source confusion. Mixing episodic memories with other information, leading to distorted memories. Suggestibility. Incorporating ideas suggested by others into one's own memory. The Perky effect. confusing real images with imagined ones, or vice versa. Availability bias, recalling easily accessible examples, often seen as more relevant or important. Bizarreness effect, bizarre or unusual material is more memorable than common material. Boundary extension, misremembering a scene with a wider field than was present. Childhood amnesia, few memories from before the age of 4 are retained. Choice supportive bias, remembering one's choices as better than they actually were. Confirmation bias, seeking, interpreting, or recalling information that confirms pre-existing beliefs. Conservatism or regressive bias, recalling extreme probabilities or values as closer to the average. Consistency bias, believing one's past attitudes and behaviors are consistent with current ones. Continued influence effect, corrected misinformation continues to affect memory and reasoning. Context effect, difficulty retrieving memories out of the original context. Cross-race effect, difficulty identifying members of a race different from one's own. Egocentric bias, recalling the past in a way that enhances one's own role or attributes. Euphoric recall, remembering past experiences more positively, overlooking negatives. Fading affect bias, emotions attached to negative memories fade faster than those of positive memories. Generation effect, better recall for self-generated information than for information generated by others. Gender differences in eyewitness memory, remembering more details about individuals of the same gender. Google effect, tendency to forget information easily accessible online. Hindsight bias, seeing past events as having been predictable. Humor effect, humorous items are more easily remembered than non-humorous ones. Illusory correlation, perceiving a relationship between events when none exists. Illusory truth effect, familiar statements are more likely to be believed as true. Lag effect, better memory for information studied over time than in a single session. Leveling and sharpening, memory distortions where some details are lost while others are emphasized. Levels of processing effect. Memory effectiveness varies with the depth of processing. List length effect. Longer lists result in lower recall percentage, but more items recalled overall. Memory inhibition. Difficulty recalling unshown items from a list when shown some items. Misinformation effect. Memory becomes less accurate due to post-event information. Modality effect. Better recall for spoken items at the end of a list than written ones. Mood congruent memory bias. Easier recall of information matching one's current mood. Negativity bias. Stronger recall for unpleasant memories compared to positive ones. Next in line effect. Reduced recall for information presented just before one's turn to speak. Part list queuing effect. Showing some items from a list makes recalling others harder. Peak end rule. Memories judged by how events felt at their peak and at their end. Persistence. Recurring memories of traumatic events. Picture superiority effect. Pictures are more easily recalled than written words. Placement bias. Overestimating one's abilities in areas of self-assessed competence. Positivity effect. Older adults' preference for positive over negative information in memories. Primacy effect. Better recall for items at the beginning of a list. Processing difficulty effect. Information processed with difficulty is more memorable. Recency effect. Better recall for items at the end of a list. Reminiscence bump. Enhanced memory for events from adolescence and early adulthood. Repetition blindness. Difficulty in recalling repeated elements in a sequence. Rosy retrospection. Past seen as better than it was. Saying is believing effect. Adapting messages to audience expectations can bias memory. Self-relevance effect. Better recall for information related to oneself. Serial position effect. Best recall for items at the beginning and end of a sequence. Spacing effect. Information is better recalled if exposure is spread over time. Spotlight effect. Overestimating how much others notice about oneself. Stereotype bias. Memory distorted toward stereotypical expectations. Suffix effect. Diminished recall for the final items of a list when a non-target suffix is added. Sub-additivity effect. Underestimating the total probability of a set of events. Tachypsychia. Altered perception of time during high stress or high focus moments. Telescoping effect. Misplacing events in time, making recent events seem more remote and vice versa. Testing effect. Enhanced memory after retrieving information during tests. Tip of the tongue phenomenon. Inability to recall a familiar word with partial memory of it. Travis syndrome. Overvaluing the present, thinking it more significant than the past. Verbatim effect. Easier recall of the gist of information than its exact wording. Von Restorff effect. Items that stand out are more likely to be remembered. Zeigarnik effect. Uncompleted tasks are remembered better than completed ones.
This is Chestacho.